Dolly Parton has spent 60 years making the world love her, and she's very good at it. The smile never wavers. The laugh comes easy. She'll joke about her wigs and her figure before anyone else gets the chance, and somehow that disarms every room she walks into. But here's the thing about a woman who controls every narrative about herself so perfectly. She learned that skill somewhere. She learned it from being burned, from being sued, from having her voice literally stolen and twisted into something hateful, from turning down Elvis Presley while she cried herself to sleep and still knowing she made the right call. The Dolly that stands on every stage today, gracious and unshakable, got built through fights she mostly refused to have in public. 5 names kept coming up, quietly, over the years. 5 people who found out that warmth and toughness can live in the exact same person. Dolly Roberta Parton came into the world on January 19, 1946, the 4th of 12 children born inside a one-room cabin in Pittman Center, Tennessee, and poverty was just the air everyone breathed. Her father Lee couldn't read or write, but he worked hard and spent money carefully. Her mother Avie Lee sang mountain songs and told stories, which turned out to be the most valuable inheritance any of the kids received. By age 10, Dolly was performing on local radio and television. At 13, she recorded her first single and stood on the Grand Ole Opry stage where Johnny Cash kissed her on the cheek. The day she finished high school in 1964, she packed her things and left for Nashville, and she never looked back. Nashville in those years wasn't waiting for her. She started as a songwriter, selling her work to other artists while she figured out how to build a singing career from scratch. Her first hit, Dumb Blonde, announced immediately that she wasn't going to be underestimated. In 1967, Porter Wagoner invited her onto his television show, which reached millions of viewers every week, and that changed everything. The two of them recorded over a dozen top 10 hits together, their voices blending in a way that made audiences feel something real. Songs like Coat of Many Colors and Joshua showed she could write stories that cut straight to the bone. By the early 1970s, I Will Always Love You and Jolene had established her as something rare, a singer who was also a genuine poet of everyday heartbreak. Here You Come Again pushed her into pop territory, and then 9 to 5 with Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin made her a movie star too. She opened Dollywood in 1986 in Pigeon Forge, investing her money back into the Smoky Mountain community she came from, rather than spending it on herself. Her imagination library has placed over 200 million free books into the hands of children around the world. In 2022, Jeff Bezos gave her $100 million to direct toward causes she believed in. Rolling Stone listed her among the 200 greatest singers in history. Time named her one of the 100 most important people in the world. There is even an asteroid carrying her name through space. She was offered the Presidential Medal of Freedom 3 times and turned it down every time, wanting no part of political territory. That's the kind of woman she is, someone who built an empire while refusing to let anyone else define the terms. None of that happened without conflict. The first battle, and the one that shaped everything that followed, started with the man who gave her the stage in the first place. Porter Wagoner was a country music institution by the time Dolly joined his show. The rhinestone suits, the commanding stage presence, the millions of loyal viewers, he had built all of it himself, and he knew it. When Dolly replaced his previous singing partner Norma Jean in 1967, some of his fans pushed back hard. Dolly absorbed that, kept performing with everything she had, and won them over anyway. On screen, the partnership looked effortless, their chemistry genuine and warm, and behind the microphone their harmonies were something special. What wasn't visible to the audience was the growing pressure underneath. Porter operated from a position of control. He had discovered her, developed her, and in his mind that created an obligation that didn't expire. But Dolly's ambitions were expanding faster than the show could contain them. She wanted to write music that didn't fit the Porter and Dolly format. She wanted to be treated as an equal, not a protege. And the longer she stayed, the more that stage started feeling like a cage dressed up in rhinestones. By 1973, the tension had become impossible to ignore, and in 1974 she made her decision. She sat Porter down in his office and instead of simply telling him she was leaving, she sang him something she had written for exactly this moment. I Will Always Love You was her goodbye, her thank you, and her apology all folded into one song. He was reportedly moved to tears. He let her go. And then 5 years later, in 1979, he sued her for $3 million, claiming breach of contract and demanding a share of her income for life. The lawsuit dragged what had been a complicated but tender professional relationship into a courtroom and into every entertainment headline in the country. It settled quietly out of court. Dolly later said Porter received her first $1 million and that it took her a long time to pay it off, but she felt she did what was right. By the late 1980s, time had begun softening the hard edges between them, and in 2002 she took the stage to induct him into the Country Music Hall of Fame, calling him her mentor and a part of her heart. When lung cancer took him in 2007, she went to visit him in the hospital before he passed, and afterward she held a private tribute concert at Dollywood. not for cameras or press coverage, just for him. She once described their dynamic as oil and water, two things that never quite mixed but somehow needed each other anyway. The situation with Elvis Presley arrived next, and it played out as one of the most painful decisions of her career. Elvis had heard "I Will Always Love You" in the early 1970s, and felt it deeply enough that, according to Dolly, he sang it privately to Priscilla during their divorce, which says something about how that song reached people even before Whitney Houston made it a global phenomenon. For Dolly, hearing that Elvis wanted to record her work was staggering. She had grown up idolizing him. The idea that the king of rock and roll wanted her song felt almost impossible to believe. Then Colonel Tom Parker stepped in. Parker's demand was standard practice for him, but a deal-breaker for her. Elvis would only record the song if Parker and Presley received at least 50% of the publishing rights. Every songwriter who wanted an Elvis recording faced this choice, and most took the deal because the exposure was worth it. Dolly didn't. She understood that her publishing rights were the foundation of her financial future as a songwriter, something very few women in country music had managed to protect. And she wasn't going to hand half of that to a manager with a reputation for putting his own interests above everyone else's. She said yes to walking away from Elvis, and then she cried through the night because of it. Nearly 2 decades later, Whitney Houston recorded the song for the Bodyguard soundtrack and produced one of the best-selling singles in music history. Because Dolly had held on to 100% of her publishing rights, the royalties made her one of the most financially successful songwriters alive, with estimates placing her earnings from that single song alone in the tens of millions. The heartbreak of 1973 paid for everything. The friction with Linda Ronstadt was quieter and slower burning, which almost made it worse. The two of them, along with Emmylou Harris, formed one of the most celebrated vocal collaborations in country and folk music history. The trio album succeeded beyond what any of them had predicted, and fans immediately wanted more. Behind the studio doors, though, Dolly and Linda were wired completely differently. Dolly moved fast. She had more projects running simultaneously than most artists manage in a career, and she came into sessions ready to deliver her parts and move on. Linda treated the studio like a laboratory where perfection was the only acceptable outcome. She would record the same passage again and again, adjusting every detail of tone and timing until it landed exactly right. To Dolly, that felt slow and frustrating. She once called Linda a pain in the ass over her pickiness on takes. To Linda, Dolly's willingness to cancel sessions at the last minute felt like a lack of commitment to the work. When Trio 2 kept getting delayed, and Dolly pushed for the release date to move even further out, Linda reached her limit. She took songs from the project, removed Dolly's vocals, and released them on her own album Feels Like Home. Dolly had given her voice to those recordings, and now they existed in the world without her. That felt like a betrayal, personal and direct. Linda saw it as a practical decision, not a personal one, but Dolly, who measures loyalty above almost everything else, couldn't separate the two. Their connection faded without ever producing a loud public rupture, which in some ways felt lonelier than a real fight. Both women repeatedly praised each other in public. Dolly called Linda one of the most beautiful voices she had ever heard. Linda described Dolly as a force of nature as a songwriter. But the warmth stayed at a distance, and Trio 2, when it finally came out, didn't carry the same feeling as the first record. Howard Stern's offense in 2008 was of an entirely different category. Stern had taken audio from Dolly's memoir recording, My Life and Other Unfinished Business, and used editing software to rearrange and manipulate her voice into fake statements where she appeared to say deeply racist things and attack other artists, including Linda Ronstadt. Dolly had spent her entire career being genuinely kind to people, and her voice had been engineered into hatred. When she found out, she released a statement saying she had never in her life felt so shocked, hurt, and embarrassed, and that she would never say anything so rude or inappropriate, and that she believed they had manipulated her voice to create something awful and offensive. She told the public directly that if there was ever going to be a lawsuit, it would be over this. For Dolly, who almost never reached for legal threats, that language signaled how deep the wound went. Stern called it a parody, said it was absurd and funny, and claimed he was honored she even knew who he was. His fans shrugged. Hers didn't. Dolly didn't file suit. She didn't grant interviews about it. She let the moment exist and moved on, which was both graceful and pointed. 15 years passed. In 2023, promoting her rock album Rockstar, she appeared on his show for the first time since the scandal. Stern was respectful throughout the interview, called her a legend, kept his edge mostly holstered. The tension was still visible underneath the pleasantries. Nobody in the room pretended it wasn't there. Jeff Tweedy of Wilco offered a different kind of slight, smaller in scale but personal in its own way. While acknowledging her place in music history, he suggested her lyrics lacked depth, that her songs leaned on catchy melodies rather than real meaning, and that she should have stopped writing after Jolene. Dolly didn't fire back publicly. Her catalog, built from lived experience and emotional honesty, had already been performed by artists across every genre imaginable and had outlasted entire musical movements. She let that answer for her, which is something only someone very confident in their work can afford to do. What all 5 of these relationships share is that Dolly Parton walked through each one without losing herself. Porter tried to own her and she left, paid what she owed, and still stood at his grave grieving. Colonel Parker tried to buy half of her future and she said no through tears and still came out richer than anyone could have predicted. Linda hurt her and she praised her voice anyway. Stern attacked her character and she shook his hand on camera 15 years later. Tweedy dismissed her writing and her songs kept traveling the world. She never pretended none of it happened. She just refused to let any of it define her louder than her work did.